moving swiftly on to our environmental policy presentation. So yeah, if you are ready to go, then we're very much looking forward to your research presentation.
Yeah, I think I'll quickly introduce the team. So as you know, the next up is the environmental policy team. It's composed of Andrew, Nicholas, Sam, Charles, Helena, Roman, and finally Harvey, who is the team leader. And their paper explores the level of ambition in UK's Green Recovery Plan. Over to you guys.
Okay, can everyone see my screen okay? Yeah, perfect. So we are the Environmental Policy Group, and our research has been focused around exploring the level of ambition in the UK's Green Recovery Plan. So in our team, we have Andrew, Charles, Helena, Nicholas, Roman, Sam, and myself. So in this presentation, we will outline why we wanted to look into the UK's green recovery, the reasons why countries are choosing to adopt green recoveries, and the different strategies that 4 different countries are taking. I'll then talk about our methodology using the Saunders et al. Research onion as a framework, and highlight the results of our content analysis. We'll spend some time focusing individually on 5 different sectors which we identified, exploring the level of ambition in each and what other countries are doing in comparison.
So COVID-19 has undoubtedly impacted the global economy, and our research aims to focus on recovery strategies at a time when countries are issuing policy packages to tackle the pandemic and boost their economies. So as said earlier, we will focus on the UK 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, issued in November 2020, that places climate mitigation at the core of its ambitions. And this plan builds on the British government's commitment to the nationally determined contributions of the Paris Agreement, whereby the UK has committed to reduce its economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions by 68% by 2030. So to give you an idea of the impact of COVID-19 on the economy, the global growth contraction for 2020 was estimated at minus 3.5% by the World Trade Organization. And the UK's real GDP has suffered an annual percent change of minus 10 in 2020, based on the IMF estimate. And let's recall that in the context of economic recovery lies the opportunity to bring climate change mitigation at the forefront of the new decade. Both economic recovery and climate mitigation are not exclusive. They can be addressed together through what the OECD defines as green recovery, that is, the potential to create opportunities for income, jobs, and growth, and at the same time, accelerate action to medium and long-term environmental goals, both national and global. So OECD studies have shown the importance of green stimulus in economic strategy, such as after the 2008 financial crisis. So it's not a brand new thing. In that very case, it produced greater job creation as well as social well-being. Then it produced greater job creation and social well-being than traditional recovery measures. And so far within the OECD, 30 countries have committed to the idea of a green recovery after the pandemic. So considering the British government's commitment to the nationally determined contributions, our research seeks to analyze the UK's 10-point plan in comparison with France's Plan de Relance, Germany's Konjunkturprogramm für alle in Deutschland, and Japan's actions in implementing a green recovery. And through this comparison, we assess the ambition of the plan by focusing on policy instruments used in every national strategy. And just for simplification, we've grouped the 10 points in 5 subcategories: transportation, buildings, renewable energy, environment, and green finance.
So I'll now discuss our methodology, which we based on the research onion from Saunders et al. So this provided us with a clear approach and rationale in designing a methodology which was appropriate for our research question. So first of all, in the outermost layer, we adopted a pragmatic philosophy, as this paper does not aim to describe or represent reality. Secondly, an inductive approach was taken as conclusions were built from the data rather than tested through hypotheses. And this approach has been chosen as it is best suited to a document analysis, which is exploratory by nature. Thirdly, we chose to use an archival research strategy in which we used administrative records and documents as the principal source of data, focusing mainly on governmental documents which related to green recoveries post-COVID. Due to time and resource constraints, we adopted a mono method, just focusing on a content analysis. And finally, a cross-sectional approach was taken, meaning that policy reports from green recoveries were analysed across multiple geographical locations. In this case, we looked at 4 countries in total. The countries we chosen were the UK, Japan, Germany, and France, and they were all chosen based upon the fact they were at similar stages of economic development and had accessible literature on green recoveries. So in practice, we searched for governmental documents using the search term green recovery. And once we found relevant governmental documents, we then read and analysed them using an open coding method. This allowed themes to develop and flow naturally out of the data. So the unit of analysis for the different policy tools used, and in total we had 138 different observations, which created 5 groups and 11 subgroups. And finally, it is important to point out that we have not just based our conclusions on the number of policy instruments used, but we have also considered the amount of funding given to each initiative and any targets they might have set. For example, when looking at renewable energy, we also considered the amount of gigawatt each country had been looking to achieve. We were also just concerned with looking at literature, which was a direct response to the pandemic, and that was considered by the country to be a recovery measure. So to briefly skim over the results. So when we look at the UK's 10-point plan, we can see that there is a wide range of policy instruments used across the board. Their main focus in terms of policy instruments is transportation, buildings, and renewable energy. And then what sets the UK's plan apart is that they do not just focus on a few areas, but rather have initiatives for most different sectors. And we'll explore each of the different sectors individually in the coming slides. Next, we have France, and their main focus is on sustainable agriculture within the environment sector. And this is due to coronavirus prompting the modernisation of livestock farming to increase biosecurity, which they have done through both skills training and research development subsidies. France is also seeking to improve the sustainability of transportation through the development of new low carbon bus and rail services, which have been outlined in the Annex Fiche measures. And then on to Germany and Japan. So from our results, we can see that Germany was mainly focused on transportation in terms of policy instruments used, as shown by the 4 different policy types. Germany was also focused on renewable energy, focusing mainly on hydrogen and offshore wind. Japan, however, has focused their green recovery on the research and development of carbon capture, usage and storage technologies, and also a very large green finance grant. And it must be pointed out that for both Germany and Japan, their recoveries were more focused on particular sectors rather than cross-cutting measures.
So we're going to have a look at renewable energy to start off with, and renewable energy is a fantastic area for economic recovery, as you can have large-scale infrastructure investment and investment in R&D, which can kickstart an economy. So it's a good area for governments to invest in, and it has featured in all the countries' recovery plans. But as you can see, they've all used different levers to achieve this, and as you'll see, they invest and are going to get involved with different sectors. Sorry, I have the next slide on. Thank you. So offshore wind is going to be a huge part of the British, German and Japan recovery plans, and for their going into the future for producing renewable energy. The UK is the current world leader in offshore wind production, and it's planning on quadrupling that by 2030 to produce 40 gigawatts of energy. It's going to back this up with £130 million investment in the surrounding sectors, and it's also got quite a novel approach to the bidding process for the production of wind farms. It's basically going to guarantee those investors that if the price of the energy that they produce is more than the cost of energy at the time, that they will cover the difference. And this basically gives a big risk reduction for investors, which allows them to get more generous loans. Germany and Japan have still significant, but a bit more modest funding for this, and they're, sorry, not funding, plans. And basically, as you can see, they're going to do 20 gigawatts for Germany by 2030, and Japan going to do 10. And then they're both going to get to around 40 gigawatts by 2040, which is a significant portion of electricity generation. For all 3 of them, they're going to do this through a bidding process, and it's going to be private investment, and there's going to be very little government intervention. And that's just simply because the price of electricity produced by offshore wind is so competitive. Now we're going to move on to hydrogen, and hydrogen is an interesting sector because at the moment it's not really operational. It doesn't produce any electricity, But France and Germany are planning on investing very heavily in this area, and both want to be world leaders in this field. Both of them are putting large budgets, as you can see, averaging about 7 billion by 2030. The UK has gone for a lot more of a modest approach. It's only investing £240 million, but it is planning to leverage £4 billion of private investment, although in the 10-point plan, it doesn't mention at all how they're going to do this. And myself, I'm a bit skeptical how they're going to manage that. Germany's also tried to use a different method. It's not just looking at investment. It's set up the National Hydrogen Council, which is a group of 26 academics and business leaders to try and help the government formulate plans for how hydrogen is going to become a key industry in Germany. And finally, we move on to nuclear power, which is the most divisive of the renewable energies that are in the plan. It's a big part of the French and British recovery plans, but as you'll see, Germany and Japan are basically walking away from nuclear. France already produces 75% of its energy from nuclear, and so it's not actually investing in the building of new power plants. Instead, it's investing in the R&D of the future of the nuclear industry, and also basically in the maintenance of the current infrastructure. The UK has created a £385 million advanced nuclear fund, which is going to split between advanced modular reactors, which are involved in large-scale nuclear power plants, and in small modular reactors, which are a very novel and kind of new approach to nuclear energy, which is basically a factory-built much smaller nuclear kind of plant, which can be transported around, and that's going to be done by Rolls-Royce, and it's going to be interesting to see if that's actually financially feasible, but they're going to take the risk on that. It is being worth saying that Scotland, which is obviously part of the UK, the government there has decided that nuclear power will not be part of its future. So any new nuclear power plants will not be built in Scotland. Japan, we weren't able to find a huge amount of information on their plan when we were researching it. But since the Fukushima disaster, they've basically, public opinion on nuclear energy has dramatically changed, and it's become very difficult for the government to push forward with any advancement in nuclear power. They used to be one of the largest nuclear energy players in the world, but that's basically dramatically fallen, and they've had to close a lot of their plants, and they're just not operating them. And Germany has just kind of clinically decided that it's not going to have nuclear energy as part of its future, and it plans to shut down all its plants by 2022. And instead, it's as part of its recovery plan, it's actually investing a small amount of money in the safe disposal of nuclear waste.
Okay, so let's move on into a discussion of carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So interestingly, you can actually see that the UK leads in terms of the financial amount of money committed, right, compared to a number of the other countries. And while the UK carbon capture and utilization storage target is quite ambitious, as you can see in the numbers on the left side of the slide, it's also quite questionable, because if you look at the record of how much the UK has invested into carbon capture, utilization, and storage, it's actually quite limited. And another thing to note is that while the current proposed UK policy is quite inward-looking, so it emphasizes a lot about deploying and scaling up, actually, we found that when we compare this with the other 4 countries in the study, other 3 countries. So the UK actually really does seek to benefit politically and technologically from achieving a balance between deployment, but also collaboration and research, as Japan, something that Japan has focused a lot on in its own kind of carbon capture and utilization storage strategy. So if we move on to the next slide about green finance, we can see that in terms of buildings, right, they're actually the second largest source of emissions in the UK. And this was from a December 2020 white paper. So from an economic point of view, this 7th point in the plan is already quite ambitious, because it aims to create 50,000 jobs by 2030 and attract more than 11 billion pounds of private investment in the 2020s in order to save 71 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent between 2023 and 2032, or in other words, 16% of the UK's emissions in 2018. And that's mainly by focusing on sustainable retrofitting. So there are a few schemes here, right? So the first one is the public sector decarbonization scheme, which basically releases funds for energy efficiency and low carbon heat upgrades in public buildings. And there's also the extension of the 1-year Green Homes Grant and voucher scheme with a £2 billion budget, and also the Homes Upgrade Grant, and also a social housing decarbonization fund at around £50 million. So to accompany these funds, there have also been some other regulatory measures which have been imposed and will aim to lead to the installation of around 600,000 heat pumps per year by 2028. Now, on the other hand, France has been even more ambitious in its financial investment compared to the UK plan, and it actually has a dual focus on new sustainable housing alongside refurbishment. So that's why the kind of recovery plan has mobilized around 5.74 billion UK pounds for the energy renovation of public and private buildings, around 394.4 million pounds for energy renovation and major refurbishment of social housing, and finally around 300.1 million pounds for a new housing as part of the effort to relaunch sustainable construction. Germany, on the other hand, has had only one line in the energy efficiency of buildings in its green stimulus plan, and that focuses only on renovation. So it just simply concerns an increase of around 1.7 billion pounds over 2 years for a carbon dioxide building renovation program. And lastly, Japan, there's not much information on this, but it does have a subsidy program to promote the introduction of net zero energy houses and buildings. And thus it really does focus only on new construction rather than retrofitting as well. And in addition, it's important to note that their stimulus program at the building level seems to focus more on health regulations like ventilation rather than sustainable housing regulations and retrofitting per se. So we move on to green finance here. There are a few key takeaways, right? So among the 4 countries, as mentioned earlier by Harvey, Japan's investment into green finance is literally like 4 times that of France, which is the next highest green finance investing country. However, in terms of like the regulatory shift, France's mandatory greenhouse gas emission commitments on large companies which are requesting a response package from COVID is a far cry from the kind of UK's effort to just establish its first sovereign green bond. So here the key point is that it's not just about trying to create new bonds, but it's the fact that the UK can actually hugely benefit from instead of establishing like these new bonds, but focus on the fundamentals. So for instance, getting buy-in from private sector or clear definitions on environmental social governance instruments. And that's actually where a lot of the effort can be concentrated as well. So I'll pass on to the next speaker.
Okay. So with respect to sustainable transport, all countries have promoted the idea of active travel in order to reduce the public's reliance on and demand for personal vehicles, while at the same time encouraging other modes of transport as well as exercise. So we can see that the UK is investing significantly, mainly through grants and loans, into greener, more active travel with the introduction of the Emergency Active Travel Fund. So this basically aims to promote and increase the viability of cycling and walking as alternative modes of transport. The UK government has also invested a £2 billion package to support initiatives which include both the promotion of active travel, as well as improving rail networks and city public transport through the introduction of zero-emission buses. Germany is similar. The German support plan comes in the form of a £2.2 billion package aimed at improving public transport in general. The most notable German initiative is the increasing of the vehicle tax on passengers, which will urge consumers to consider using alternative modes of transport. The French plan invests £1 billion to address climate change and air pollution problems through promoting greener mobility. This includes similar support measures, such as creating safe and efficient cycling networks, improving the efficiency and usability of railways, and the development of new bus services in urban areas. However, France is particularly notable in its scale of support for the railway sector. It's allocated £4.1 billion, which is significantly more than either Britain or Germany, to modernize and improve their rail networks. We can move to the next one, Harvey. So all 3 countries also use similar policy instruments in the case of EVs. They're mostly focused on grants and loans for car companies, with a smaller amount of money devoted to R&D initiatives. So recently, the UK has committed to ending the sale of new diesel and petrol cars and vans by 2030, while allowing the sale of hybrid cars and vans until 2035. So these regulations have been implemented with a view to becoming 100% reliant on zero emissions cars by 2035. The UK government has earmarked around £2.8 billion to support the production of EVs. And of this money, £1 billion will be allocated towards supporting the electrification of UK vehicles, as well as securing their dependent supply chains. The other £1.3 billion will be set aside for developing and constructing new EV charging infrastructure. £582 million is also being dedicated to extend electric vehicle grants, while there's also been investment in pioneering zero emission and hydrogen heavy goods vehicles and lorries. France is also comparable to the UK in this respect. The French government has similarly focused on allocating money to improving the sector through R&D subsidies. It plans to spend around £1.62 billion between 2020 and 2022 to subsidize electric automobiles, conversion bonuses, and the implementation of more charging infrastructure. Germany leads in terms of the amount of funding allocated. So in Germany, over £4.27 billion has been allocated towards supporting the EV industry. The German federal government is looking to contribute around £2.2 billion towards promoting EVs. In addition, the German government has also set up a bonus program to promote investments in new technologies, processes, and plants relating to the EV industry. And in terms of setting up charging infrastructure, £2.14 billion has been earmarked towards investing in the expansion of charging stations across the country, as well as research in the field of electromobility and battery cell production. The German government has also set itself more specific objectives with respect to charging infrastructure. So for example, the German government has given itself an obligation to ensure that all petrol stations in the country offer charging as well as offer charging stations at public places such as daycare centres, hospitals, and sports grounds. By contrast, the UK government has focused more broadly on mostly developing charging points on motorways and major roads. Yeah, we can move to the next one, Harvey. So sustainable aviation and shipping in all three countries are characterized by investment in supporting R&D initiatives, as well as through grants in order to drive the market. So the UK aims to use R&D specifically to create sustainable innovation in aviation, which is intended to drive market competition in the long run. The government has allocated funding towards supporting studies which investigate the strategic, technical, and commercial issues relating to developing zero emissions aircraft, as well as the technologies necessary to achieve net zero aviation. The government's also announced a £15 million competition to support the production of sustainable aviation fuels in the UK. In terms of the maritime sector, a further £20 million grant will be invested into the Clean Maritime Demonstration Programme to develop clean technology. The German plan concentrates on grants and R&D as well. Their aim is to support the accelerated conversion of aircraft fleets to modern aircraft and have allocated a grant of £860 million as an instrument to drive the process of the conversion of aircraft. Furthermore, the German government have supported many programs to strengthen and modernize shipping as a climate-friendly means of transport. And this includes, among other things, shore rehabilitation, replacement of ships, and digital test fields. The French plan is similarly concentrating its financial resources on R&D. The £2.23 billion has been allocated over the next 2 years to support the diversification and modernization of production chains. So basically, it can be seen that while the UK has specific research aims with respect to sustainable aviation and shipping, its monetary support is far more modest compared to Germany and France. We can move to the next speaker.
Okay, yes, so onto the environment quickly. The points in the environment have been separated into 3 categories, which are protection of the natural environment, adaptations to climate change, and agriculture. In terms of preservation of the natural environment through monetary efforts, Germany is investing the most and is concentrating on the protection of forests with 700 million euros. France is investing 395 million euros, also concentrating on forests, but also the natural landscape more broadly through the support of local projects with local authorities for ecological restoration, not just in forestry. The UK is investing £80 million and they emphasize the creation and designation of more of England's landscapes as national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty. And so what we can see is that France especially, and the UK too, are dedicating their efforts more broadly, also investing in non-monetary policy instruments, such as the development of skills and knowledge, as well as jobs, whereas Germany is dedicating their efforts more through policy instruments of grants and loans. So for the section on climate adaptations, the findings here show that in terms of monetary support, the UK is leading. They are investing 5.2 billion for coastal defences. This is followed by Germany with 1 to 2.5 billion euros, who are, however, only indirectly investing in adaptation through their support of buildings. So what Nicholas talked about earlier, the Germany's plan only mentions adaptations, adaptation measures in social institutions, rather than the environment itself, for which the CO2 building renovation program is utilized. And again, France's investments are the broadest, also taking into account, also taking into account overseas territories. However, the allocation of grants for this section is lower than the UK and Germany. And then Japan is characterized by its heavy usage of R&D as main policy instruments. So for example, they have this idea of Theme D, which is aiming to analyze future changes in hazards and their social impact in order to then provide important information and the necessary methods for preparing no-regret adaptation measures. However, there seems to be little information on monetary support made available for this adaptation measure. Okay, then agriculture. France's efforts in sustainable agriculture are definitely leading among the 3 plans discussed. They have multiple points on this in their plan, which are marked by the different colors in this table. And France provides the most monetary support, as well as dedicating efforts towards R&D and skills training, and that's very clearly outlined in the plan. Germany dedicates 300 million, however, this is not as broadly applied as in the French plan and is directed at investing support for stable conversion only, with no allocation of policy instruments towards skills training or R&D. And the UK has announced its new environmental land management scheme post-Brexit, with tests and trials and a national pilot before full rollout of the scheme in 2024, but doesn't mention any specific money and grants. And this far has, as part of this scheme, has only mentioned the creation and designation of more of England's landscapes as national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty, which was mentioned in the section on the protection of the natural environment. So it remains vague for agriculture for the UK. Okay.
So to conclude, we have determined from our research that all the green recovery plans are ambitious in their own way, with Japan being ambitious when it comes to green finance and the total allocated funding. France, however, is the most ambitious in terms of protecting the natural environment, agriculture, and the response to coronavirus in terms of increasing the biosecurity of livestock. Germany is looking to spend the most out of all the countries on hydrogen, while at the same time moving away from nuclear technologies, unlike France, who is looking to modernise the French nuclear industry. And finally, the UK green recovery has proved to be the most cross-cutting, incorporating the widest range of recovery measures across the most sectors. It's certain that other countries are more ambitious, however, in particular areas. And then ultimately, the UK's green recovery strength lies in its ability to incorporate a wide range of sectors, which is significant considering the upcoming COP26, which is being held in Glasgow. And this sets the tone for the conference, signalling to all participating countries that the UK is determined to achieve net zero by 2050. So we'd like to take this opportunity to thank both Dr. Serban, Scrisiu for the extremely useful methodological advice, our peer reviewers for all the feedback, and the BBI for putting on this conference.